I remember when I was there and Jim Lee would come into the studio every now and then and he would check out what everyone's up to. And he was looking at something I had drawn. So here was this inking technique, and Jim was saying, but I don't think you're doing it as it's meant to be. Stop it. So I did, and I don't think I've done it since then.
Hey, welcome back to the studio. While my friends are in San Diego Comic Con enjoying the sunny weather of San Diego, it's sunny here in Toronto too.
If you know anything about comics, even in passing or pop culture in general, you'll know that San Diego Comic Con is certainly used to be the largest in the world. It's changed since then, but I mean that's neither here or there. But yeah, it's a major convention that a lot of publishers and a lot of creators really look forward to attending. And early on in my career, I was pretty lucky that I believe I attended the convention for, geez, I don't know, like maybe just a little over 10 years in a row, right? And I figured maybe what I could share is a few things and a few thoughts about San Diego Comic Con and conventions in general as it pertains to the different stages of my career and how it might potentially impact or affect or something that you might relate to, I suppose. This isn't like, these are my favorite memories of San Diego Comic Con, and I feel like it might devolve into that where I'm just telling old war stories. But for your sake, I figured I would talk about some of the things that perhaps could be much more beneficial to you, whether you're an aspiring creator in the comic book field or whether you're already in the industry. So early on in my career, importance of San Diego was pretty prominent, it felt like. It certainly was something that at the time I was working for Top Cow, and it was the first time that I had the opportunity to go to the big show. It was certainly large back then, but it's only since become even more of a mega convention since then. At the time that I went, it was still primarily focused on comic books, and since then the rise of Hall H and all of the multimedia stuff has really ramped up, and it was interesting to see that come up. To go from this comic book focused convention to really a multimedia event, right? The thing that you have to remember is that I believe over 100,000, maybe 140,000 people attend the show, or even if they're not at the show, a lot of people choose to go there for their vacation while they attend the convention, right? And aside from Europe, where I remember coming off the plane and I would see prominent advertisement of the convention across the city, San Diego was one of the first convention cities that I had attended who had the convention advertisement plastered all over the city. To me, that was such a cool thing to see. It felt like a lot of the conventions that I had attended in my younger days, you would kind of only know it's there if you were a comic book person. There was certainly no mainstream signage or advertisement or news coverage about it. It was a thing that was happening, and it just wasn't of interest to the general public at that time. So the importance, I guess, of San Diego Comic Con early on in my career was two things, right? At the time, because I was coming up, Top Cow's goal was to put me and also quite a few of the other upcoming artists through the convention circuit, and San Diego was certainly one of the biggest ones. And it was a way for us to meet the fans, interact with them, do free sketches, and sign free books. That's just how it was back then. And it was a way to really nurture a fan base for us. A lot of people who attended the convention, it felt like if they had a good experience with you as creators, they would follow your work, and that was certainly the goal. It was equal parts helping us nurture a fan base, and also it was a way to introduce us new guys to the industry and to the people who were already big fans of Top Cow and everything that they were doing, right? So there were many reasons that perhaps now on paper they're not, if this was corporate speak, they're not quite tangible. The success of those conventions were pretty intangible. You couldn't analytically say, based on going to this convention we gained this many followers. It was literally a shot in the dark, but that's just how things were done back then. And attending, as an artist, attending San Diego was definitely something that was beneficial to your career. And what was good for your career, because a lot of us were exclusive to Top Cow at the time, was also beneficial for the company. What was fun about those early years as well is that you could definitely feel the shift once the mainstream media were coming in. I remember when we were starting out, Top Cow was a pretty prominent independent publisher, but they didn't have the deep pockets that the studios have. And what was interesting was that throughout the years, as some of the bigger studios started coming in, you could definitely feel the push. It wasn't like a symbolic push. It felt like an actual physical push, because I remember the hotels we used to stay at were literally right next door to the convention. And then throughout the years, it certainly felt like there were fewer and fewer rooms to occupy that were of prime location, especially back then, right? I mean, as grateful as I am to have had that opportunity. And don't get me wrong, those were extremely fun days. I never went to college or university. So to me, sharing a hotel room with another creator felt like the true college experience of everybody just shacking up. And it was definitely something that I did when I was trying to break in with other artist friends of mine as we were attending conventions, trying to show our portfolio. So it definitely wasn't something that I wasn't used to. I was quite accustomed to it. And what made it awesome was that it was free. They paid for it, So that was what it was like early on. It was a lot of grinding it out at the company booth, trying to build relationships with fans, one sketch and one signature at a time. It literally felt like a place where you could get an instant feedback on whether the fan base is behind you or just indifferent to what you're doing. And it definitely was something that was uh, what's the word, encouraging, I guess, or energizing, I suppose. And it was just a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. It was a great time. It was an opportunity to also meet a lot of creators who I was a fan of. At that time, I was in my very early 20s, and getting to rub elbows with creators whom I'm a massive fan of, that was a big deal. Not only was I getting to attend these conventions as a professional, the fanboy in me couldn't help but take stock of the people who I was now not surrounded with, but the people who were now part of, I suppose, our social circle. I mean, look, I wasn't in those circles, but I was in a circle of people who were part of those circles, so so those were extremely fun and exciting times, and I think of those times very fondly. After the early days, there was a certain point in time where I was beginning to rise up in the industry a little bit more. And at this point in time, I was no longer a top cow. I was now exclusive at DC, and I had worked on this book called Adventure Comics with Jeff Johns, who is now obviously a big part of my current career. It's interesting how he played a major role in my earlier origin stories, and to this day, here we are now over at Ghost Machine. So, anyways, I went from sharing hotel rooms and living the, I guess, dirtbag lifestyle of you know trying to do these conventions on the cheap, I suppose, because they only paid for so much. To I now found myself in a pinch me moment where I'm like, I don't know what the heck is going on. Chapter one, was shacking up with a lot of other creators in a single room as we're just trying to make a name for ourselves. To now, here I was at a convention. They paid for everything. They put me up at the good hotel, which was pretty. I was pretty thankful for that. And on top of that, I was doing a spotlight panel that Jeff Johns was moderating. At that point in my career, I would say I was now I wasn't a rookie anymore, I guess, if we were gonna talk in basketball terms. So anyways, this, I guess, second chapter of my experience at San Diego Comic Con was one of greater opportunities, and I suppose one way to put it is greater access than what I once had. I didn't know that there were things in San Diego that were called green rooms. I didn't know that I could get free food and snacks here and there, which, I found kind of interesting because it felt like when, I was a poor startup comic book artist, it felt like everything was expensive. And then now here I was starting to make a name for myself. And then, ironically enough, things that I was now able to afford was suddenly free. You know, Explain to me how that works. And I know how it works. I'm not stupid, but you know, it felt like it was more of uh, like somebody had opened the door and said, "Hey, I know that you've been attending this restaurant for a couple of years, but did you know that there's a back door with all these cool other things that you didn't know existed?" Right? What's interesting about that is at these convention parties, you would have the opportunity to meet certain creators who are, coming in from different stages of our careers, right? And you could definitely feel, again, based on the access that you have, on what stage you were in, because certainly if you are somebody in the know, and there are certainly some people whose social circles run pretty deep, and they have access to a lot of things. It was definitely, you could definitely feel it. There was a palpable difference between somebody who was in the know and in it versus in the past, when I was on the inside, but really it felt like I was not quite an outsider, that I was the new kid on the block. And I think that's something that you're going to feel at some of these conventions. While socially a lot of people are very nice and welcoming, you will find that early on in your career at these conventions, you just won't have access to certain things. And as you go further along in your career, you're going to find that a few more doors are going to open up. And that certainly felt like the case in the second chapter of my career. And it just felt like the new goal for those conventions was less, hey, let's try to build a fan base. It now felt like, hey, here's an established fan base that you have. How do we grow it, right? How do we expand it to an even larger audience? How do we make people more aware of these things? And on top of that, because early on in your career, when you're achieving a certain momentum of success, it was also very beneficial for the publisher for you to be there. It was you were now becoming a draw. You were now a reason for people to visit a booth or go to a signing or whatever, right? It was now, it went from I'm happy to just be there and, you know, to try to get known. And I was grateful for the opportunity to be there to now understanding that this is a business and the access and the things that you are being given or opportunities that you are now receiving, it's not from like the kindness of their heart. It's a business, right? They now know that you have a certain fan base that is beginning to grow, and they know that this is a beneficial um, transaction for them to have you there, helping represent the company, helping represent the books that you're working on, and it was great. I was like, this is pretty awesome, right? You it felt like I went from meeting some of my heroes and introducing myself as somebody who was upcoming, and you know knowing what I know now, there's certainly a lot of people who are on the come up that really just disappears because it for a myriad of reasons. But suddenly I was now meeting my heroes, and it felt more like as peers rather than um, somebody. I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I still fanboy over meeting quite a lot of them, but at the same time, um, it did feel like they were certainly a lot more open to conversing in a more relaxed way. It's like they know they're not gonna that you're not gonna fanboy over them. I mean, I was internally, but I've been around the block long enough that I was able to hide it a lot easier. Except for the first time I met Jim Lee, I certainly fanboyed a lot, and it definitely felt like a quite an embarrassing introduction to him. Chapter 2B of that career was something much more expansive, something that went beyond the convention. At that time, Wildstorm was still operating in San Diego, and it was now a part of DC Comics. So even though I was working for DC, Wildstorm was a very strong part of the company, right? And one of my best friends in the industry, whom I've known since my old Top Cow days, he's the guy whose couch I literally slept on for quite a few years when I would visit Santa Monica. He was the guy whose couch was always kept warm for my arrival. And it's this artist, Joel Gomez, and his wife, Beth Sotelo. They're fantastic people. And, he was, he had a few years more experience than me in the industry. And, it was fantastic to have somebody who felt like a big brother to me, and somebody who was able to actually really help me understand the social structure and the social aspect of this industry. At the first time I met him early on in my career, I was really, as they say, wet behind the ears and quite naive. And he certainly was somebody who woke me the heck up. So, anyways, that's the story for another day. So he was now working at Wildstorm, and so every time I would go down for the convention in San Diego, I would essentially once again, even though I was now a little bit further on in my career, I found myself now back on his couch once again, before the convention, right? So before the convention, I would visit a week or two early, and I would hang out the Wildstorm studio. I would draw there. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. A lot of what we did was essentially just eat lunch, but it was really cool to see a lot of my favorite artists there. Carlos Dianda was there, Ali Garza, Richard Friend, Ryan Benjamin. It was fantastic to be in that environment. And chapter 2B of my convention experience was something that felt a lot closer actually to the early part of my career when I was part of the Top Cow studio, where I would go into we called it the pit, which was essentially the bullpen of artists. And here I was. At the time, I hadn't been working in a studio for a few years. I was primarily just working from home. So getting a chance to hang out was once again a fantastic learning experience. So it was kind of a creative rediscovery, I suppose. Okay, now we're getting to actually the meaningful things that was really beneficial to me as an artist, and my growth, in terms of my knowledge. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that these artists who felt like they were on a pedestal and just a little bit out of my reach were now my peers. And with them becoming my peers, what came of it was, I suppose, a much more relaxed access. And by access, that came in the form of being able to go to the Wildstorm studios, hang out for a week or two, learn from everybody there. And that was a really amazing time. Quick aside story time. I remember when I was there, and Jim Lee would come into the studio every now and then, and he would check out what everyone's up to. And I remember, I can't remember what it was that we were doing, but he was looking at something I had drawn. And at the time, you have to remember this is early 2000s, right? There are certain things artistically that were in vogue back then that's certainly not anymore. And I used this technique that essentially created line separation called a halo. A halo is a gap between one ink line to another. Typically, let's say the background is all black, and then you draw the character. A halo is that thin blank space that you would leave out to help separate the character from the black background. Now, what was interesting about that was that typically the whole point of using a halo is to create separation between something really busy and the thing that is meant to be the central focus. But somewhere along the way in the 2000s, it became just an artistic flair that a lot of people used. One of the artists who popularized it, and it was certainly the reason why I was doing it, was I was a big fan of Joe Madeira and Tim Townsend. And I remember when Tim would ink Joe, there would be quite a liberal use of halos, and so I started using it. But in comes Jim, and he's looking at my work, and he's like, well, I understand that you're using halos to try to create separation, but I don't think you're doing it as it's meant to be. I remember, I think it was a drawing of Batman where I had his leg, I drew his leg, and I did a halo between his leg and the black background, right? So his leg was in the shadows, but I drew a halo, right? And Jim was saying, you have to be mindful that when you're using a halo, you have to use it with purpose. Otherwise, it it's actually doing the opposite of what you think it's going to do, right? And by that, the whole purpose of a halo is to create clarity in the image. And but here I was using a halo because I thought it looked cool. So here was this inking technique which was meant to create clarity, and there I was using it in a very wrong way and creating visual clutter. And I remember him telling me, "You stop it." So I did, and I don't think I've done it since then. So that was a great, great moment in San Diego that didn't happen at the comic convention. It happened in La Jolla, where Wildstorm Studios used to be. But I certainly wouldn't be in that position had I not been there for San Diego Comic Con, right? So that is a whole chapter of my career and in comics that I remember and will remember very, very fondly. I just realized, even though I said I would talk about certain inflection points in my convention career that would hopefully be beneficial to you, but now I'm realizing I'm really just telling old war stories. Now, mind you, old war stories that have a little bit of a lesson. Listen, I am inking and talking at the same time. I am inking and talking at the same time. So what comes out is what comes out. So chapter, where was I? Am I in chapter 3? I don't know. I think it's chapter 3. Maybe it's chapter 4. Anyways, so the next chapter of my San Diego Comic Con experience was quite different than the first 2 or 3. From the perspective of somebody who was beginning to, I suppose, make their way in the industry, this next chapter that I entered into was a lot more corporate. Whereas the previous years were definitely, it felt more like I suppose, a party environment, but at the same time, it felt a bit like a networking experience, I suppose. A crash course in networking, what to do, what not to do. I feel like that's a whole other video discussion to be had later on. But for the sake of brevity, and brevity isn't exactly my strong suit. So, anyways, in this new chapter, when I say corporate, when I would, not even when I would, leading up to the convention, there would be a lot of email exchanges from editors, writers, and publishers, and a lot of it was setting up meetings. And these meetings really covered a range of topics, from discussing current contracts to discussing upcoming storylines to potential publishing initiatives. I would say that particular time felt more about the initiatives and the alignment of goals that the company have with you as the creator. Whether you were the right fit or whether you weren't the right fit. Fortunately, those experiences was more a right fit sort of thing. So it certainly felt like a lot of my interactions at at that convention at that time, aside from an artist alley that was that's a whole other experience. Let's just strictly talk about this particular line of experience. Anyways, what was I saying? So anyways, the conventions at this particular chapter now felt more like it was about meetings. Now, mind you, I say it as if they're not exciting. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They were very exciting. They were invigorating, because here I was getting an opportunity to talk to my editors, and Dan Didio, who was the editor in chief and publisher at the time, and he would fill me in on the lay of the land of what he was thinking of doing and where he saw your place in this thing that he was doing. And, he would ask, well, what do you think you'd like to do? you know, and that's something that every creator longs for, which is the publisher saying, hey, what would you like to do? Early on in my career, it was less so what I would like to do. It's more what is available. I was That's available, great, I'll take it. And then but then as you progress in your career, you will then have the fortunate opportunity to be much more in control of your career and what you're working on. And San Diego Comic Con was definitely a place that publishers and editors would meet with quite a lot of the creators. You have to remember that creators from all over the world would be at these conventions, and it was an opportunity for the higher ups at DC, and I'm sure this goes the same for Marvel and any other publishers. It was an opportunity for them to have some face-to-face time with the creators who are in their roster, right? And it was an opportunity to discuss, the creator's future in the company, and also discuss some of the initiatives and the future publishing plans of the company. So yeah, that this particular chapter was definitely um, much more corporate. This would currently be the last chapter in my San Diego career. Not the final chapter. I mean, I'd like to think I have a few more years under my belt when it comes to a career in comics. I was literally entering a new chapter in my life, not in my career, but in my life. I had become a father, and I knew that going to San Diego Con, when I would go, I would be away. I would travel to San Diego and I would travel to LA, and I would be there for 2 to 3 weeks. And that was a long period of time. And that was something that it was definitely time that I could dedicate early on in my career, being a person who didn't have responsibilities beyond themselves and beyond the work that I was doing, right? So here I was, a brand new father. In fact, my daughter had just been born a few months before San Diego. And for the first time in over a decade, I was not attending um, San Diego. It definitely felt like a sad to a streak, but at the same time, I was so overwhelmed with becoming a father that San Diego wasn't really even in my mind at all. I wasn't thinking about uh, experiences I was losing. I was just here. I was freaking out uh, over the fact that holy crap, I'm a dad now. You know, this is now a new set of experience, which where there is a lot for me to learn. So there was no intention for me to attend San Diego Comic Con until out of nowhere I get a message from this very prominent marketing agency, and they were working on what is called an activation. I didn't know what that was at the time, but they were working on something with Kellogg's and also the company that Zachary Levi had created. He's the actor who played Chuck, and he would eventually go on to become Shazam. So they were creating an activation in San Diego. Now, one thing to keep note, and as I mentioned this earlier, at the beginning of my San Diego attending experience, it was really more about comic books than media. You could see it coming up, but it certainly wasn't the focus. Around the time that actually in the previous chapter where my experience became more about meetings, and again, by meetings, those are fun meetings. You go out for dinner, you go out for lunch, and you're just sitting there having a drink and you're just discussing things. They're far from a difficult task, and it felt a lot easier. Anyways, around that time is when Hollywood and multimedia companies were taking notice that this convention played a major role in pop culture. So, there they were. They would attend these conventions. I remember, massive building posters of Dexter. And, that has nothing to do with comics. I mean, mind you, there was eventually a comic book. But at the time, it was just, it was a big it was a big pop culture event that every media company wanted to attend. So needless to say, the attendance of these things grew exponentially because it now had a much broader audience than it used to, which meant that the convention hall itself was so packed that a lot of people would be in the city of San Diego, even though they weren't able to attend the convention because the city itself started creating events around the convention that really gave the audience and the fan base a convention like experience offsite, I suppose, in San Diego, literally right across the street from the convention center for this activation, essentially for a cereal company for Kellogg's. And there I was just across the street. I was doing basically like some live art performance, I guess. I wasn't at San Diego Comic Con to attend and experience comic books and meet with publishers and meet with fans. I wasn't there for that. I was there strictly create and be a part of this um, activation. That's essentially what it was. And, you know, it was a lot of fun. It was something that um, I'd never done before. It was a great experience. The staff and crew were fantastic. And even though I was there in the city, I still went out with my comic book friends at the end of the day, but I wasn't in the convention, you know. I was offsite. I was doing basically a very corporate look. It was cool. I got to meet Zachary Levi, took a picture, shook his hand. Very, very nice guy, very tall. Now, mind you, he's very tall, and also I'm very short, so that creates quite an imbalance, visual imbalance. Anyways, yeah. So it was a very interesting and different perspective of the convention. I felt a bit more like an outsider. It certainly isn't how I would have liked to have ended. Um, Not ended. I say it as if my career is over or that I'm never attending San Diego again. But it was definitely an interesting last hurrah at the convention. For me, like I said, as a parent, I can no longer dedicate the time to go there and disappear for such a long period of time. Um, and so, to have that particular chapter of my San Diego Comic Con experience and in a more corporate way, it would have been nicer to have ended it, in a classic comic book fashion. But at the same time, um, you know, I suppose that's that's on brand with the San Diego Comic Con experience because it felt like, every time I went, every couple years, it was a different experience for me as I was going through the different stages of my career. And, if you are watching this or listening and you are in the industry, you'll soon understand what I'm talking about when it comes to experiencing San Diego through different um, chapters of your life and your career and how the dynamics of that really changes based on your place in the industry in that moment in time you know um Yeah. Here's a fun San Diego convention story. So I grew up in this city, I guess, in a part of Toronto called Scarborough. I suppose it's like a suburb, but Toronto is a massive place, so it. Anyways, I grew up in Scarborough, right? And in high school, I have uh, artist friends. That's not true. I had two artist friends. Um, and one of them, he started a comic book club, and so I met him, and I met this other guy he liked to draw Warner Brothers characters, like Bugs Bunny and Tasmanian Devil and all that stuff. So yeah, so here we were in our comic book club, and I met this guy who, he liked to draw. He wasn't really that into comic books. He was more into drawing animated characters, so like Bugs Bunny, the Tasmanian Devil, Daffy Duck. He loved doing that stuff. He was also really funny. He's the kind of guy who liked nerdy things, but he was so personable that he was literally voted like the valedictorian of our graduating class. I don't know if it's because his grades were good or he was just so likable, but he was that likable. So so anyways, flash forward to many years later, right? So here I am at San Diego, and me and my friend Joel, we we were riding around in a golf cart at like 1:30 in the morning or something like that. And we had this cooler full of beer in it. And we were in this golf cart because we were being transported from one hotel to the other. And this thing was really heavy. I'd like to say that we were in a golf cart because we were like hot shots or something like that. Not at all. We literally just we saw this guy riding around, and we were trying to carry this heavy cooler of beer, and we're like, hey buddy, can you give us a ride? We'll give you a couple bucks, and he was like, yeah, sure, man, no big deal, right? So here's me and my good friend Joel. I'm sure both of us were at some point at different stages of inebriation, and we were riding around the cart. And as we were driving along the sidewalk from one hotel to the other, I see this guy who's like really familiar, and I realize it's that same guy that I went to high school with, Mr. Valedictorian, Mr. Really good artist who loved drawing Bugs Bunny and all the Warner Brothers cartoon and stuff, you know, and I was like, dude, what are you doing here? And I think he was equally shocked to see me. And, we were catching up, and, he was like, "Well, what do you do?" I'm a comic book artist now. I'm here for the convention. What are you doing here? And he's like, I'm also here for the convention. I'm like, are you an artist too? Right. Because I remember him drawing when we were younger, and he's like, no, 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 I used to work in animation, and I do something else now. I'm like, well, what do you do now? Right. And he's like, well, I'm a voice actor now. And he was the voice actor for, I believe at the time, one of the Ninja Turtles. Right. And I was like, no way, this is amazing. I can't believe the circumstance that we find ourselves in many, many years later, from our city of Scarborough to now bumping into each other on the streets of San Diego at one of the biggest events when it comes to a pop culture convention. And I know I buried the lead here, but those in the know probably know who I'm talking about. My friend from high school is Eric Bauza, who would eventually become, I believe, the first Asian voice actor to be the voice actor for Bugs Bunny, among others. He's done a lot of stuff since then. I believe he. This is pretty freaking awesome. I believe he voiced Bugs Bunny in Space Jam 2, the LeBron James version, not the Michael Jordan version. Michael Jordan version, we were still kids. Anyways, I thought that was really, really cool. And I think one of the neat things about San Diego that I feel I miss, I didn't think I miss it that much, you know. 'Cause I'll be honest, I barely remembered that San Diego Comic Con started today, and I only noticed because everybody on Instagram and in our group chat started posting about it. But one of the things that I'll miss are the random bump-ins that you encounter in San Diego. When you have an event that is so embedded in pop culture and things that that we all enjoy, you know, like, look, if you're watching this, you probably like comics or art or animation or movies, right? And what I found fascinating about San Diego is that people attend this show from different points of their career. You're going to get a cross section of aspiring creators, and at the same time, you're going to get a cross section of full on famous people in Hollywood or video games who love comics, who love pop culture, who love telling stories. And here they all are descending upon this relatively sleepy city of San Diego, and it becoming such a bustling city for that entire week that, you know, if you intend to have dinner, you better have reservations. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting 2 hours to be seated. Yeah, it's definitely a pop culture phenomena, the convention, and it's definitely something that I would say is worth an experience at some point in your life if you are into comic books or anything in pop culture. It's definitely an event that I used to look forward to quite a lot when I was younger. But now that I'm a parent, I look forward to no events except for going to bed. Um, to all my friends who are at San Diego, I miss you. I wished I was there. Not really. It's thinking about being there is exhausting, but I do miss all of you, and I think often very fondly of the good times I had there. And to all the friends who I've made, and to all the friends who are there that I'm missing, I hope you guys all had a great time, and I'd be curious to see or hear what those experiences are like for them, because I'm sure it has changed significantly from when we all used to attend these conventions as you know, snotty-nosed young kids and scrappy artists who are on the come up. I'd be curious to see how your experience was. I hope it was enjoyable, and I'll be here at the drawing board keeping the desk warm for everybody. Cheers. And listen, if you've enjoyed any of my videos and you want to support my work, make sure to check out the collection of the Rocketfellers Volume 1, which collects the first 6 issues. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you